So what we have up on the screen are going to be a series of questions, and I'm just going to hold this question here for just a sentence, for a bit, and unpack it just a bit. And this is a question of, why do we have a system where pastors are appointed by the bishop rather than a system where congregation decides who will or will not be their pastor? This might be the most common opening question we get asked in some variation when we do coffee with the pastors or we get new members or whatever. They have a rumor. There's a rumor that I hear that Methodists move their pastors or something, and you don't get a say in it. And there's a bishop that we never know about. What's that all about? How long are you going to be here? All of that stuff. So because this is the most common question, I'll use this as an opportunity to talk about our structural systems that are fundamentally different, particularly as we live here in Texas. Okay. In the United Methodist Church, the Book of Discipline, our guiding book, says that the most fundamental building block of the denomination is not an individual or a local church. It is the conference. What is a conference? Does anybody know what a conference in the United Methodist Church is? Part of the jurisdiction. There you are, very good. The United Methodist Church is known for lots of things, but we are not known for naming things anything uniquely. There's a conference for everything. And sometimes it's a verb and sometimes it's a noun. So the annual conference not only describes how often that group meets annually, but also is the name given to the body itself, which is super confusing. Our annual conference is called the Central Texas Annual Conference. It is composed roughly now of about 200 churches. And those churches are bound together in a geographic region. In the state of Texas, there are 5 annual conferences. North Texas Annual Conference, Rio Texas Conference, Northwest Texas Conference. There's even one down in Houston. They just called themselves Texas Conference. Houston. So these conferences, there's 5 of these large bodies that are bound together, that bind local churches together. And those annual conferences are the building blocks of the denomination, okay? That's where all the action happens. And from there, there's action that happens above and below, but everything goes in and through every annual conference. Annual conferences are bound together in a similar way to create jurisdictions. Across the United States, there are 5 jurisdictions. Currently, we are in the South Central jurisdiction, okay? 5 jurisdictions. We're in the South Central jurisdiction. We are in the Central Texas Annual Conference. Those jurisdictions are bound together. Along with the entire global denomination, conferences outside the United States are called central conferences. All of those, we love to name them everything conference. All of those are bound together and meet together every 4 years at something called the General Conference. Okay? So there is this global structure that breaks down regionally, which breaks down locally, which breaks down to a local church. Right? In this way, the United Methodist Church values and affirms a theological understanding of vertical accountability. So, every annual conference has a bishop that presides over that annual conference. And the bishop's job, in large part, but not exclusively, is to tend to the temporal and spiritual well-being of that conference. That includes things like creating conference-wide ministries, setting budgets, doing things that maybe a local church might do, but at a bigger scale. Additionally, that bishop is responsible for the appointing of every clergy person in their conference. Every clergy person is at a certain point in the process is guaranteed to have an appointment. Sometimes that's at a local church, sometimes it's not, but they're guaranteed an appointment. So the bishop works really hard to try to find where the right fit or a good fit is for an individual's gifts and graces and the conference needs and the needs of that local church. Now, the conference bishop can't do that on their own. They have a cabinet that they work with. That cabinet makes those appointments. So, the reason that there's a vertical accountability to it is that when a local church pastor or an elder, I happen to be an elder, Esty is an elder, Dan is a licensed local pastor. When a clergy person arrives at a local church, they are held accountable not to the local church in a horizontal way, but held accountable in a vertical way to their district superintendent and the bishop. Now, this is helpful and frustrating simultaneously. I'll take the inverse. This system, this vertical system, is called an Episcopal system. If we did not have an Episcopal system, we would have what was called a congregational system. Every local church hires and fires their pastors. Would be the most kind of pressing or salient example of how that gets manifest. If you're a pastor and you feel God is calling you, right? Kathy has mentioned that being a servant leader means you go where you're called. And you're a local pastor and you feel called within a congregational system to speak a hard thing to the people that have hired you, how likely are you to speak hard things to the people who are responsible to hire and fire you? It's difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it is very hard, right? And in many ways, that can create the conditions where individuals come to church for confirmation or even rather than transformation. Are you with me? If you don't like what the pastor or the church is doing at a congregational church, you can work to hold one another accountable on this level, right? And that probably works well for the vast majority of churches. But I'm sure that we all can also imagine where the groupthink takes over, right? And there becomes an insular thinking where the corruption or the problem or the sin is kind of within, and there's no mechanisms to dislodge, right? I'm sure that we all can think of examples where this has happened. That's not uniform and that's not universal, but that can create those problems and those issues. And so in many churches that are congregational, I will meet folks and I'll say, "Oh, what church do you go to?" And they'll tell me the name of the pastor. They won't tell me the name of the church necessarily, but they'll say, "Oh, I go to pastor whatever's church," right? Again, that's not a knock. It's just that's an expression of the congregational system, right? Now, in the United Methodist Church, we move from a exclusively horizontal level of accountability to a vertical level of accountability. And that is, if a local pastor, I'm taking preaching as just a very small example, but it's a salient one. If the preacher feels called to say something or to preach something or to teach something that might challenge, even if possibly offend, affront some sensibilities, maybe turn over a table or two, the local church has to figure out how to be with that. Because the local church pastor is held account to the bishop and the district superintendent. Now, I'm confident that you can also think of situations where corruption and sin take over in a vertical system. The Catholic Church issues are horrible. And you move people around to hide them in the system, and that is awful. And we should repent of that entirely. No system is ever flawless or perfect. That's not the claim. The claim is that in the United Methodist Church, we adhere to a call system where we are called from one place to another so that the local church does not become, or is less likely to become, a cult of personality of the pastor, right? But a communion of saints. It's part of the reason that here we're able to say things like, well, Keller United Methodist Church is my church, right? It's not the pastor's church. Are you with me? That creates a whole set of beautiful opportunities and a set of potential disappointments. Some of those opportunities include, how many of you are convinced that when the ancient Jews in Jesus' time, they sat around and they all agreed what the Messiah was going to look like? They all agreed this is what the Messiah is going to look like. And then when Jesus showed up, they immediately identified, oh, well, that's the Messiah, yeah. That did not happen. That did not happen. Oftentimes, we as humans, the Methodist Church acknowledge, don't know what we need. And so we need help. We cry out for Christ. We need help. We need an outside perspective to help. And so sometimes you'll get a pastor appointed to a church that you would have never chosen. It's not what you think you need. Because oftentimes we're operating out of what we want, right? Not necessarily what's faithful. So the United Methodist Church sometimes appoints people that you might not have chosen when you look at the resumes. And you got to figure out how to be in relationship, how to do this together, right? It also creates conditions where can be some significant disappointment. I'll just take the example of where the pastor and the congregation work really well together and they're beloved and everybody loves one another and it's just hooray. And then one day, seemingly out of the blue, Russ or Shannon or some SPR member stands up here and says, our pastor's been appointed to, like Pastor Lauren. Pastor Lauren's been appointed to Cleburne. And that can kind of hurt. But, like we've said in all sorts of settings, God calls. No one belongs to us. We all belong to God. And God calls, and we go. So, this system here, why do we have this system where pastors are appointed by the bishop rather than a system where congregation decides who will not be their pastor? I can go into lots of other reasons, but fundamentally, theologically, the church functions in this Episcopal system to adhere to or to try to live into a vertical system of accountability. Does that make sense? The next questions that we have, if you'll go to the next slide. And doesn't it make more sense, this is kind of a response here, doesn't it make more sense that the people get to decide who their pastor is? Like many non-denominational or many local Baptist churches around here, they get to do that. Again, there's benefits to that. How many of us, I went to the doctor, actually, not to brag, but I went to the doctor, and the doctor told me a series of things that I did not want to hear. I need to start changing my diet. I need to start seeing him more frequently. And I need to monitor my family history a little bit. And I was like, cool. I'm getting a new doctor, right? I'm going to go find a more friendly doctor. Doctor will tell me what I want to hear, right? That doctor is actually a part of a system that he or she is bound to, a vertical system where they're working to try to bring health and wholeness to everybody. They take an oath, right, in that vertical system with other fellow doctors. Again, it's not perfect, it's not flawless, but that system matters. The next set of questions you'll see, why are we holding on to this system? And the last few minutes, I just want to highlight this. The United Methodist Church is sometimes critiqued for being old-fashioned or slow to change because it's holding on to this hierarchy system in a world in which it's getting flatter and more dispersed, where kind of power is driven downward, right? I mean, this is business stuff you hear all the time, right? We need to diversify, we need to bring things down to the local level, we need to have more local control, kind of disperse all of that and remove kind of hierarchies. With the assumption that all hierarchies are problematic and bad and should be kind of torn down, because what's most faithful or whatever is kind of this system. The reality is that the United Methodist Church's history, it ties back to the Church of England, which ties back to the Catholic Church, which ties back to, at least apocryphally, to the Peter, right? And that call system of Christ, Peter, Church, that vertical system. So you're right, we're holding on to this system in large part because we think it is a faithful expression of what it means to be a disciple, a follower of Christ, who is held into account vertically.